Welcome back to Morning Live. Now, Statistics South Africa have revealed that youth aged between 15 and 24 years of age are the most vulnerable in the labour market. Unemployment among this age group it actually is at 55.2% in the first quarter of 2019. And among the graduates in this group, the unemployment rate was 31% during this period compared to 19.5% in the fourth quarter of 2019. And that is an increase of just over 11%. Now, Mampeleng Mohlomi is an international relations and political studies graduate from Wits University. Khaya Sithole is a chartered accountant whose passion is to mentor students, preparing them for the marketplace. And we also have with us this morning Hendrick Makaneta, who's an education activist. And we did extend an invitation to both departments of basic and higher education, but those were, of course, unsuccessful. So thank you so much to all of you for coming through. Youth unemployment, and the statistics are rather scary. If we're talking about 55.2% in the first quarter of 2019 rather, and we are told that this does not include, of course, the number of youth job seekers who have now become despondent, those who've stopped looking for jobs. And we're told that if we include that number, we're looking at something more in the region of 69%. So others predicting that we will, within the next few quarters, reach that 70% statistic of youth unemployment. That, of course, is a disaster.
No. I think calling it a disaster is underestimating the impact of it. It is literally a looming social crisis. The big problem, of course, is that we must understand what the consequences of unemployment are. These people who are not able to access economic opportunities have to depend on someone else. So they really become a social burden either on their families or even their communities. And of course, it is within that gap where literally there's absolutely no prospects for these people, where situations and issues like crime tend to creep in. So I think for me, the big question that we should be asking ourselves is, how do we end up with a nation and with an economic construct that fails to absorb young people at all? But also, not only does it fail to absorb them, it doesn't seem to actually have a roadmap of saying this is how things are going to be done differently. So I do think that, unfortunately, for us to keep talking about just the percentages and the numbers might actually not make people aware of just how big the crisis is, because if you translate this to actual human beings, you're talking about millions of young people out there who wake up this morning, have absolutely nothing to do for the rest of the day, have absolutely no idea how they're going to buy their next loaf of bread. So for me, it really is just beyond an economic crisis, really a social crisis that is saying that the social compact that we signed up for as a country is completely disintegrated.
But when you say there's no roadmap to deal with this, a government minister in the presidency, then Jeff Khadebe, signed the National Youth Plan, was it, and it was aimed to at least get some things done by 2020, which is, of course, next year. So how has that plan fared? So,
of course, the big problem that we have with government is not the question of policy being formulated, it's a question of policy implementation. So what you wanted to be able to see is for everybody to have an understanding of saying, if there's going to be a National Youth Accord that gets written out there, what exactly are the particular levers that need to be activated in order for it to become a reality? So if you ask him right now, if you call Jeff Khadebe and say, so what were these things that you put in place when you signed that youth accord that have now failed to materialize, and how do we fix them? He himself has no idea what that means. So the big problem, of course, is we need to be able to understand exactly what is it that the government is committed to doing. Have they committed to saying we're going to absorb young people in the workplace through small and medium enterprises? If that's what needs to be done, what have we done to achieve that? So the big issue here is that we struggle to go back to them and say, this is what you promised, where has it gone wrong, and tell us how we can assist you to fix it. They simply make these bold pronouncements that are not backed by really scientific data, and when things fall apart, they cannot themselves go back and say, oh, the reason things fell apart is because this one particular input or this one particular variable hasn't worked out the way that we wanted it to work. And that's obviously a problem with government at large.
Mampeleng, where do the solutions lie? Because we often hear about education and that crisis, and how there's a mismatch between the skills that our graduates leave the institutions of higher learning with, as compared to what the private sector actually requires them to have when they go into the workplace.
With me, unemployment is a reality in my life. It has been since graduating, and I believe that we need to, in a sense, restructure the recruitment process within South Africa. You graduate from university institutions and are expected to have a amount of work experience, which you do not have. And then you are offered internships, but then what happens when those internships come to an end? Then in my situation, then I've had to then look for other solutions for myself so that I can survive. And that being having to opt for positions that do not relate to what I studied, downgrading what I should be doing and start working in admin positions that do not really help my CV, do not even train me in what I actually studied at school. So I do find that education is important, but right now education is not the only solution in finding employment, because there are graduates that are unemployed. Already amongst graduates between the age of 15 and 24, that's the highest rate. So government needs to somehow meet business enterprises halfway in finding solutions on how to rectify the whole recruitment process.
But the problem then, Hendrick, is that we've been hearing about these mismatches, we've been hearing about the policies and all sorts of rhetoric around this particular problem, or maybe we should call it what it is, a crisis. But we're not seeing any inroads being made with regard to alleviating the plight of young people in trying to find jobs in this country.
Yeah, I think that our observation is that government is making commitments from time to time to try and alleviate the challenges that are faced primarily by young people. But our view is that, government alone will not be able to resolve the challenges of unemployment amongst others that are facing young people in the country. We need the private sector to also come on board and ensure that, they create employment. But of course, our education system as well needs to be re-looked at because the current system as it is will not be sustainable in the long run because our learners in school level as well as our students at university level, their psyche is that they must seek for employment at the end of their careers. There are very few people who go into entrepreneurship, and we believe that, government must find a way to collaborate with the private sector to ensure that, at some point jobs are created. But of course, one of the major issues is the question of skills. There are jobs that are there, but, the skills that our people have do not match the existing jobs. That is a cause for concern because once, I know that, for instance, they've dealt away with the issue of, having the experience. Experience is no longer an issue, as government has recently deliberated. But the question of skills becomes a huge problem because if I have a company, for instance, the primary objective is to make profit, and I'll employ those people who will be able to assist me to make the necessary profit and not necessarily employ all the people who are there.
But perhaps part of the problem then, Khaya, is the fact that we keep repeating the same old song over and over again. Yeah. We've been hearing about government and the private sector collaborating, coming up with plans. We saw at the Job Summit last year, pledges were asked and, of course, commitments were made. But here we still have a young person right here, right now, still an unemployed graduate complaining about, how she is not even able to practice that which she studied for.
Yeah, and I think the great tragedy is that the evolution of the workplace happens at a much faster pace than the evolution in really what is the feeder place, which is the education system, whether it's basic or even higher education. So, of course, what you're seeing is that there's the widening articulation gap, where by the time people graduate, the type of things that they've been learning in their institutions of higher learning are not necessarily things that are needed even at the entry level in the workplace. And unfortunately, when government does make some particular pronouncements in relation to particular where they said that experience will no longer be a requirement for entry level jobs, that's a wonderful thing to say, except of course it relates to public sector jobs, and who said there are entry level jobs in the public service in the first place. We all know that the public service is already over employing people. So I think that pronouncement by Minister Ayanda Dlodlo, it made sense at that point in time, but probably came about 10 or 15 years too late. She was not able to get big business and the private sector to sign up for a similar compact, which is to say, look, we do understand there is a massive articulation gap between what we're teaching young people and the skills that are needed. So therefore, it's a bit meaningless to ask them for experience when we know that they don't have it. So how do we bridge that gap? And I think that, of course, the role of institutions like the CETAs, for example, needs to be amplified in this. And as I said earlier on, all these structures exist, all these policy frameworks exist. What is always missing is simply just that capacity to implement. And I do suspect that if Cyril Ramaphosa is going to leave a particular legacy, his legacy will be defined by the fact that he came in when 70% of young people who said, look, we've given this country a chance to make things happen for us. We are asking for opportunities. Those are the 70% of the young people that in 5 years' time will then have to go to the ballot box, and literally it will be a referendum on his legacy. And I know that he has done some great work. I mean, I've done work with Shanduga Black Umbrellas. He's done incubation for, small businesses. He's also even assisted in the education department, particularly in the Free State, where Shanduga did a lot of work. So he has a very intimate understanding of what the problem is. Now, whether he can then galvanize his fellow cabinet members to sort of really understand what it is that he wishes to do and to make it a large-scale impact is going to be his biggest challenge over the next 5 years. And of course, it starts with him making the right choices even in the cabinet appointments.
But the problem is, of course, a lot more intricate. When we look at the Department of Basic Education, for example, when we say our 9 and 10-year-olds cannot read and write with, any sort of effective comprehension skill, what does that mean? What sort of graduates do we then produce from our schools in the end? And then you have to take from that and move them on to tertiary institutions, and the problem is just exacerbated.
Yeah, I mean, we suffer from a lethargy in really just understanding what the world of work ought to look like in 5 year, 10 years time, and really understanding what the roadmap, how the transition from a person being young, being introduced into the education system, and then eventually being able to stand up and be able to enter the job market is going to be. And I think if you sort of then start saying this is the roadmap of what a South African child should be exposed to through these particular phases, so that by the time this person turns 18 or 25 years old, they're in a position to really either decide to be an entrepreneur if they so desire, or they can be able to transition into the workplace without the type of gap that we're seeing now when somebody says that, look, I've graduated. I mean, this is a graduate from one of the more esteemed institutions in the country, and even she can't get a step into the ladder. So, of course, the question is not just really maybe restricted to, the historically black institutions, for example. It's a universal problem.
But part of the problem, of course, and Hendrick points to this, and he says, we ought to be more entrepreneurial. We ought to be pointing our young people in that direction more often. And one of the things I've said, and I'm going to come to you on this, Mampeleng, is it's rather perturbing if one thinks that you would have graduates who cannot pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Because why are our graduates unable to do that?
I think it starts with the education system. We are more encouraged to be job seekers than entrepreneurs. Only when you are faced with the reality that you need another solution besides using your degree, then you start thinking of entrepreneurship ideas, starting your own business, unless it's something that you've always wanted to do from an early age. But if you went and studied something within international relations, for instance, you are expecting to be part of your DIRCOs, be part of your DTIs, but those government institutions are not providing enough opportunities for graduates.
Now, and I'm glad you say that, because this unemployment situation is not a yesterday situation.
No.
So when you decided to go in and read for the degree that you did you first do, some sort of research as to where the skills gaps were, where the employment careers opportunities rather lay, or did you just go in with what you thought you wanted to do?
I did go do my own research before I even matriculated, and also with attending events at the university where you are actually encouraged. They give you some sort of hope that this is what you can do with the specific degree, and it is in line with what you are passionate about. So when you go into it, you go there very excited, hopeful about the future, because that's what you told. You told great prospects. They don't tell you the negatives about you being a graduate that has this degree. Then what do you do? Because
in the end, Hendrick, there's only one Department of International Relations. There are only so many institutions that can absorb your skill set. So why aren't we doing more to actually make sure that when people go to tertiary institutions, they actually are aware of the skills that are lacking in the economy and maybe focus on those, and perhaps even before they get to that point, somewhere in secondary school level, there should be greater awareness about what the economy needs.
Well, I believe that, from time to time there are people who create this awareness of where the skills are needed. But if you look at our system of education, I mean, a university will offer a wide range of degrees, despite the fact that they know that, this degree, even if you have done it, there are no many prospects of getting employment. But they will still admit students and teach them.
But we can't blame them. Well, the onus has to be placed on us as a society to be more proactive and to know where the gaps are.
But at the same time, remember, students, before they get into the university level, there are requirements. A student might want to study engineering, for instance, and not meet the requirements. What must the student do? Must the student stay at home because the degree that he or she wants, she has not met the requirements? Obviously, they will say, here's a second option. Study this degree. And, most parents in the country like it, or they prefer their children to get education. And at the end of the day, you'll find that students are able to study even those courses that are not really needed by the economy, just for the sake of, being educated.
But how useful is that to our country, to our economy, Khaya? Because this is why we're sitting with unemployed graduates, because they cannot be absorbed.
Look, I think the great tragedy, of course, is really this lack of coordination between the workplace being the employers and the institutions of higher learning being the universities. Because what you want to be able to say is that there should be these ongoing interactions to say, look, guys, 3 years ago you opened up 100,000 spaces for this particular qualification. Actually, the trend in the market seems to be that we'll only need about 30,000 people in the next 4 or 5 years. So please cut down on those particular enrollments, because what we're seeing here is that there is a monumental waste of resources and a monumental waste of talent where students go through this particular system, study for this particular qualification, only to find that not only has that qualification itself gone obsolete, but the limited jobs that do exist can only go to a few people. And of course, what that then requires us to do is to then interrogate, should this person actually now go back to university and pursue an alternative qualification so that they can increase their chances of being absorbed in the workplace?
With otherwise, which money? Where are they going to get the money from? Because
so you end up with that misalignment
expensive.
where a person who's got this wonderful degree is now doing a clerical position that they're not suited for. But of course, for them, it's simply a matter of, I need to be able to do something. So that is the skills misalignment that is becoming a universal problem for the country.
But could Mampeleng be doing more with that degree than seeking a clerical job, Hendrick?
Well, I believe the other challenge that faces some of our young people is that if a young person has got a BCom degree, for instance, and they don't get what they need in their field, some of them end up sitting at home. And but our encouragement is that young people should not be, sitting at home. They must be dynamic. They must find a way to find other existing opportunities. For instance,
but
I have a younger sister, for example, who had a marketing degree, but she started working at ShopRite, for example, working there. And as time went on, she was able to move from ShopRite into her career path. And I think that, many young people across the country, there are some who are already doing that. It is not automatic that once you obtain an LLB degree, you automatically become a lawyer. There are other skills that you might need in life. There are many people who have done odd jobs. You find that this person has been cleaning somewhere even before he could get his career. I'm just saying that we need to find a way as well to look at the existing opportunities, not necessarily in your field, but across,
I think we need to stop speaking in parables, because to me that means we have no solutions to what's actually going on. To say to young people they need to be more dynamic, what does that mean? And for me this is a problem that stems from the policy position from government downwards, in that we don't seem to know how to give proper direction to young people. And do you feel perhaps, Mampeleng, that you have been failed by the system?
I do more, especially because what I studied is it's something that could be useful to the government, a government institution. And I feel failed that the gentleman sitting next to me is saying what he is saying right now, by basically insinuating that all of us, we need to look for other opportunities outside what we studied. That's what we are forced to do. That's why we are stuck in positions that we are not happy with. Yeah, that's why you raised a point about having so many opportunities, but then there's a lack of skill. There is a lack of skill because we are not trained. We go to internship programs for a year, and then after that year, we fall back into that trap again of facing the reality of not being equipped enough to occupy a position which requires 2 years or 3 years of experience.
Yeah, I'm just saying.
So within, I think we need to find a gap between the process after post internships and being employed as a full-time in a full-time position, because people go for internships and then you fall back into that trap of being unemployed and having to look for jobs, and then you settle for odd jobs, and then it's a question of having to look elsewhere outside of your degree. It's a question of having to do your postgraduate, but not everyone has the opportunity to be funded to enable themselves to equip themselves with post-grad education so that they can get a proper job.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but this is, of course, a huge problem. It is at crisis proportions, but I have to thank you guys. We need to talk more about these things. Mampeleng Mohlomi is an international relations and political studies graduate from Wits University. Khaya Sithole, a chartered accountant whose passion is to mentor students and preparing them, is also a political analyst. And Hendrick Makaneta is an education activist. And as you can hear, we've got huge problems. We cannot afford to have a country sitting with the sort of youth unemployment levels that we are seeing at 55.2% in the first quarter of 2019. And as I said, by the expanded definition, we are told that is closer to 70%. Able-bodied young people sitting around not knowing what to do with themselves. Recipe for disaster that cannot be overemphasized. But let's talk about it more. Send us your views at Morning Live SABC. With that, it's time for the latest news.